On the corner of a freezing Manhattan street, surrounded by honking taxis and flickering neon lights, a man wrapped in a torn coat shouted into the night air, "You military folks think the world revolves around you." The man he was talking to stopped dead in his tracks and slowly turned around. Steam rose from manholes nearby, mixing with the cold breath that escaped both their mouths. The city never sleeps, but for just a moment, this small patch of concrete felt suspended in time. Cars rushed past, their headlights cutting through the December darkness, but neither man seemed to notice the chaos around them. One stood firm with his hands at his sides, the other sat hunched on a wooden crate that had become his makeshift chair for the evening. Between them stretched more than just a few feet of sidewalk. It was the kind of distance that separates two different Americas, two different ways of seeing the world, and two men who were about to discover they had more in common than either could imagine. Jack Morrison, 58 years old, carried himself like a man who had learned early that respect isn't given freely in this world. His boots hit the pavement with the steady rhythm of someone who had marched through places most people only see on the news. Born and raised in a small town outside Austin, Texas, Jack had spent 22 years in the Army before returning home to work construction and raised two kids who were now grown and living their own lives. His shoulders remained straight despite the weight of decades, and his gray hair was cut short and neat, even though he had been retired from active duty for over 10 years. The lines around his eyes told stories of desert heat and mountain cold, of long nights standing guard and longer days missing home. But they also spoke of laughter shared with fellow soldiers, of pride earned through service, and of a code that said a man's word was worth everything. Jack didn't talk much about his time overseas, not because he was ashamed, but because he believed some experiences were meant to be carried quietly. His hands, calloused from both military service and civilian labor, had built more than they had destroyed, though they had done both when necessary. Tonight, Jack was in New York visiting his daughter Sarah, who worked as a nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital. She had invited him to spend Christmas week in her small apartment in the Upper East Side. It was his third day in the city, and he still felt like a fish out of water among the towering buildings and endless streams of people who seemed to move with purpose he couldn't quite understand. Back home in Texas, folks made eye contact when they passed each other on the street. Here everyone looked straight ahead or down at their phones, creating an invisible barrier between themselves and the world around them. Jack wasn't the type to judge a place too quickly, but he couldn't help noticing the differences, the pace, the noise, the way people seemed to live on top of each other without really connecting. He had been walking back to Sarah's apartment after dinner at a small diner when he heard the comment that made him stop. It wasn't the first time someone had made assumptions about military folks, and it probably wouldn't be the last, but something in the tone caught his attention. Maybe it was the bitterness, or maybe it was the fact that the voice belonged to someone who looked like he had seen his own share of hard times. Jack had learned long ago that words could hurt more than bullets if you let them, but he had also learned that sometimes a man needed to stand his ground, not out of pride but out of principle. As he turned to face the source of the comment, he felt the familiar weight of decision settling on his shoulders. This could go several different ways, and the choice was his to make. Block 3, Introduction of the Homeless Man, 600 words. Samuel Ortiz, known to most people simply as Sam, had been living on the streets of Manhattan for nearly a decade. At 50 years old, his face carried the map of every harsh winter and scorching summer the city had thrown at him. His brown eyes, once bright with ambition, now held the guarded look of someone who had learned to expect disappointment from every interaction. The torn coat he wore had been salvaged from a donation bin 3 winters ago, and despite its condition, it had kept him alive through more cold nights than he cared to count. Sam wasn't always homeless. There was a time when he had his own apartment in Queens, a steady job as a mechanic, and plans that stretched beyond just surviving until tomorrow. But life has a way of throwing curveballs that no amount of planning can catch. A factory closure, some bad decisions with money, a drinking problem that got worse instead of better, and a series of burned bridges led him to this wooden crate on a Manhattan sidewalk. Pride was about the only thing he had left, and he protected it fiercely, even when it sometimes worked against his own best interests. Over the years, Sam had developed a thick skin and a sharp tongue, Sarcasm became his shield against the daily humiliations that came with asking for help, being ignored or being treated like he was invisible. He had learned to read people quickly, sizing up who might spare some change, who might actually stop to listen, and who would cross the street to avoid making eye contact. Most fell into that last category, which suited Sam just fine most days. He didn't want their pity, and he certainly didn't want their judgment. But tonight felt different somehow. Maybe it was the cold that seemed to cut deeper than usual, or maybe it was the holiday decorations that reminded him of better times. When he saw the man walking past, something about the way he carried himself, the straightness of his back, the confident stride, triggered something in Sam that he couldn't quite name. It looked like certainty, like the kind of self-assurance that comes from never having to wonder where your next meal is coming from, or where you'll sleep when the temperature drops below freezing. Sam had nothing against military folks personally, but he had gotten tired of hearing about heroes in service when he felt like society had forgotten about people like him. The comment slipped out before he could stop it, carried by frustration and the kind of bitterness that builds up over years of feeling forgotten. He expected the man to keep walking, like most people did. He didn't expect him to stop and turn around. Jack took a step forward, closing the distance between them to just a few feet. The space felt charged with the kind of tension that makes bystanders uncomfortable, though the few people passing by seemed determined to mind their own business, which was probably for the best. Jack's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of authority without being loud or threatening. "You want to talk about me, you can do it while looking at my face." Sam lifted his chin, meeting Jack's gaze with a defiance that surprised them both. There was something in the older man's eyes that Sam recognized, though he couldn't quite place it. It wasn't anger, exactly, and it wasn't the kind of aggressive posturing he had seen from other men who felt challenged. It was something quieter but no less firm. "Down in Texas, you people think you're better than everyone else," Sam said, his words creating small clouds in the cold air between them. The accusation hung there for a moment, mixing with the sounds of traffic and distant sirens that formed the constant background noise of the city. Jack's expression didn't change, but he shifted his weight slightly, a movement so subtle that only someone with military training might have noticed it. "In Texas," Jack replied, his voice steady and measured, "we don't need to think we're better than anyone. We just prove who we are through what we do." The response caught Sam off guard. He had expected defensiveness, maybe even aggression, but not this calm certainty. It was the kind of answer that left no room for argument while somehow not feeling like an attack. Sam felt his prepared comeback dissolve before it could form, leaving him scrambling for solid ground in a conversation that was already moving in directions he hadn't anticipated. Around them, Manhattan continued its relentless pace. A delivery truck rumbled past, its engine adding a deep bass note to the urban symphony. Someone laughed loudly from across the street, the sound sharp and brief before being swallowed by the night. The neon sign from the bodega behind Sam flickered intermittently, casting alternating shadows and light across both their faces. Sam pulled his coat tighter around himself, not entirely because of the cold. There was something unsettling about the way this stranger stood there, completely at ease despite the tension crackling between them. Most people, when confronted by someone living on the streets, either hurried away or tried to defuse the situation with nervous politeness. This man did neither. He simply waited as if he had all the time in the world to see where this conversation would lead. "I've seen your type before," Sam said, though even as the words left his mouth he wasn't entirely sure what type he meant. "You come through the city thinking you know how things should be, but you don't know what it's like to live here, to really survive here." Jack nodded slowly, as if considering the statement seriously. "You're right about one thing," he said. "I don't know what it's like to live on these streets, but I do know what it's like to be far from home, wondering if anyone cares whether you make it through the night." The admission hung between them, unexpected in its honesty. Sam found himself studying Jack's face more carefully, looking for signs of the usual condescending sympathy he had grown to hate. Instead, he saw something that looked almost like recognition, as if this Texas stranger was seeing something in Sam that others missed. A police car drove slowly past, its occupants glancing briefly at the two men before continuing down the street. Neither Jack nor Sam paid it much attention, both focused on the strange dynamic that was developing between them. It was part standoff, part conversation, and part something else entirely that neither could quite name. The cold seemed to intensify as they stood there, the December wind cutting through the canyon of buildings and finding every gap in their clothing, but neither man moved to end the encounter, as if they both sensed that something important was happening, even if they couldn't yet see what it was. "Nobody here cares about uniforms or service records," Sam said, his voice carrying the edge of someone who had been dismissed too many times to count. "This city eats heroes for breakfast and spits out the bones by lunch." Jack remained perfectly still, his hands relaxed at his sides, but his attention focused entirely on the man in front of him. "Maybe that's part of the problem," he said quietly. "When people stop caring about service, they stop understanding what it means to serve each other." The words hit Sam differently than he expected. He had been prepared for defensiveness or lectures about duty and honor, not this measured observation that somehow felt both gentle and cutting. Sam shifted on his crate, suddenly aware of how the wooden edges had been digging into his legs for the past hour. "You think your state is so much better?" Sam challenged, though there was less heat in his voice than before. "You don't have people sleeping in doorways in Texas? You don't have folks who fall through the cracks?" Jack's expression softened slightly, the first real change Sam had seen since the conversation began. "We have plenty of both," Jack admitted. "But where I come from, we try to listen before we judge. We try to understand a man's story before we decide what his ending should be." "That's a nice sentiment," Sam replied. "But sentiment doesn't keep you warm when it's 20 degrees and the shelters are full. It doesn't put food in your stomach or give you a place to clean up so maybe someone will give you a chance at work." Jack nodded, acknowledging the truth in Sam's words. "You're absolutely right," he said. "And I'm not pretending my hometown is perfect or that good intentions solve everything. But I've learned that respect isn't something you demand or something that gets handed out because of what you've been through. It's something you earn by how you treat others, especially when you have nothing to gain from being decent." Sam let out a short laugh, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Easy to say when you're not the one asking for handouts," he said. "Easy to talk about earning respect when people look at you and see someone worth respecting, instead of someone to step around on the sidewalk." The observation stung because it was true, and Jack felt the weight of his own advantages in ways he didn't always like to acknowledge. "Fair point," he said. "I can't know what that's like, and I won't pretend I do. But I can tell you that I've seen good men broken by circumstances beyond their control, and I've seen others rise above situations that should have destroyed them. Usually the difference isn't what happens to them. It's what they decide to do with what happens to them." Sam felt his defenses rising again, the familiar anger that came whenever someone suggested that his situation was somehow a choice. "You think I chose this?" he asked, his voice gaining an edge. "You think I wanted to end up sitting on a crate in December, arguing with strangers about respect?" "I think," Jack said carefully, "that we all make choices every day about who we're going to be, regardless of our circumstances. Some days those choices are harder than others. Some days they barely feel like choices at all. But they're still there." The conversation had moved into territory that Sam didn't like, places where his carefully constructed explanations for his life started to feel less solid. He had spent years building a wall of reasons why things had turned out the way they had, and this quiet stranger was somehow finding cracks in that wall without even trying. A group of young people walked past, their laughter bright and carefree in the cold air. They were probably heading to one of the bars or clubs that lined this part of Manhattan, their biggest worry whether they would make it past the bouncer or find a good spot to stand. Sam watched them go, remembering when life had felt that simple, that full of possibility. "You know what I think?" Sam said, turning back to Jack. "I think you've got good intentions, and I think you believe what you're saying. But I also think you're going to walk away from here tonight and go back to your hotel or wherever you're staying, and tomorrow you'll fly back to Texas and forget all about the homeless guy you had a philosophical discussion with on a street corner." Jack was quiet for a moment, considering the accusation. It was possible that Sam was right. It was possible that this encounter would fade into the background of memory, becoming just another story about his trip to New York. But something about the man in front of him, something about the intelligence in his eyes and the pride in his posture despite his circumstances, made Jack think that forgetting would be harder than Sam assumed. "Maybe you're right," Jack said finally. "Maybe I will forget. But maybe you're underestimating both of us." The conversation had reached a point where words seemed to have exhausted their usefulness. Sam sat hunched forward on his crate, his hands clasped together, while Jack stood with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting for the right moment to act. The space between them held the weight of everything that had been said and everything that remained unspoken. Jack reached into his coat pocket and Sam's body tensed slightly. On the streets, sudden movements could mean trouble, and Sam had learned to be ready for anything. But instead of pulling out a wallet to offer charity that would have felt like an insult to both of them, Jack withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. It was roughly the size of his palm, tied with simple string, and looked like something that had been prepared with care, rather than grabbed hastily from a store. Without saying a word, Jack stepped forward and placed the package on the wooden crate beside Sam, close enough that Sam could reach it easily, but far enough away that it didn't feel forced. The gesture was neither dramatic nor hurried, but it carried a weight that both men felt immediately. "Eat this," Jack said quietly, his voice barely audible above the city noise around them. "And tomorrow, try to stand up, even if it's just a little bit, even if it's just for yourself." Sam stared at the package, then up at Jack's face, searching for signs of pity or condescension or the kind of smug satisfaction that sometimes came with acts of charity. Instead, he found something that looked almost like recognition, as if Jack was seeing something in Sam that even Sam had forgotten was there. "Why would you do this?" Sam asked, his voice quieter than it had been all evening. The question carried more than curiosity. It held confusion, suspicion, and something that might have been hope, though Sam wouldn't have admitted that even to himself. Jack looked down at Sam for a long moment before answering. "Because I've been in places where I needed more than just food," he said. "I needed someone to remind me that I was still worth something, that my story wasn't over yet, and someone did that for me, even when I didn't deserve it." The admission hung in the cold air between them, creating a bridge across the distance that had separated them since the conversation began. Sam felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying. It wasn't gratitude exactly, and it wasn't the beginning of some dramatic transformation, but it was something. Around them, Manhattan continued its restless existence. Taxis honked at invisible offenses, sirens wailed in the distance, and the steady hum of 8 million people living their lives created the soundtrack that never stopped playing in this city. But for just a moment, the two men existed in a pocket of quiet understanding that made the noise seem farther away. Jack didn't wait for Sam to respond or react to the gift. He had said what he came to say and done what felt right. Standing there waiting for thanks or promises or dramatic declarations would have cheapened the moment and turned a genuine gesture into something that felt like performance. Instead, Jack simply nodded once, a movement so subtle it might have been missed by anyone not paying attention. Then he turned and began walking away, his boots creating the same steady rhythm on the pavement that had brought him to this corner in the first place. Sam watched him go, the package still untouched beside him on the crate. Part of him wanted to call out, to say something that would acknowledge what had just happened, but he couldn't find words that felt adequate. Another part of him wanted to leave the package where it was, to maintain the pride that had gotten him through countless difficult nights. But a third part, a part he rarely listened to anymore, was curious about what someone like Jack Morrison would consider worth sharing. As Jack's figure grew smaller in the distance, eventually disappearing around a corner and back into the anonymous flow of city life, Sam finally reached for the brown paper package. His fingers were stiff from the cold, making the simple string difficult to untie, but he worked at it patiently until it came free. Inside, wrapped in clean white napkins, was a sandwich that looked like it had been made by someone who understood that food could be more than just fuel. It wasn't fancy, just ham and cheese on fresh bread with what looked like real mustard and maybe some lettuce, but it had been prepared with the kind of care that spoke of respect for the person who would eat it. Beneath the sandwich, Sam found something that surprised him even more. A small thermos, still warm to the touch, filled with what smelled like real coffee. Not the bitter, watery stuff from gas stations or the overly sweet charity coffee from well-meaning volunteers, but the kind of coffee that someone makes for themselves when they want to enjoy the experience. Sam held the thermos in both hands, feeling the warmth seep through his gloves and into his fingers. The heat was more than physical. It carried with it the unmistakable message that someone had thought about him specifically, had taken time to prepare something meant just for him. In a city where most kindness came in the form of loose change thrown hastily into a cup, this level of consideration felt almost overwhelming. He unscrewed the cap and let the steam rise into the cold night air. The coffee was real, strong enough to cut through the December chill and smooth enough to suggest it hadn't come from a convenience store. Sam took a small sip and felt the liquid warmth spread through his chest, reaching places that had been cold for so long he had almost forgotten what warmth felt like. The sandwich was wrapped with the same care as the coffee had been prepared. Each layer had been arranged thoughtfully, and when Sam took his first bite, he could taste the difference between food that was given because someone felt obligated and food that was shared because someone cared. The bread was fresh, the meat was real, and someone had even remembered to include pickles, a small detail that probably cost pennies but felt like a luxury. As he ate, Sam found himself thinking about the conversation that had led to this moment. He had started the evening angry, ready for a fight with a stranger who represented everything he felt had been denied to him. Instead, he had encountered something he hadn't expected. Genuine respect from someone who had no reason to offer it and no obvious benefit to gain from the exchange. The more Sam thought about it, the more complicated his feelings became. Gratitude mixed with confusion. Suspicion battled with something that felt dangerously close to hope. He had spent years building walls around his heart, protecting himself from the disappointment that came with trusting people who ultimately let him down. Those walls had kept him alive, but they had also kept him isolated in ways that went beyond just being homeless. A police officer walked by on his regular patrol, nodding briefly at Sam without stopping. It was the kind of acknowledgement Sam had learned to appreciate. Recognition without harassment, humanity without pity. He nodded back, then returned his attention to the food that was slowly warming him from the inside out. With each bite, Sam found himself remembering things he had tried to forget. The taste of his grandmother's cooking when he was a child in the Bronx, back when the future seemed full of possibility, and his biggest worry was whether he would make the baseball team at school. The satisfaction of a job well done when he worked as a mechanic. The pride he felt when he could diagnose a problem that stumped other guys with more experience. The feeling of coming home to his own place, small as it was, knowing that he had earned it with his own hands and his own effort. Those memories had become painful over the years, reminders of everything he had lost rather than celebrations of who he had once been. But sitting on this crate, eating food prepared by a stranger who had bothered to see him as more than just a problem to be solved or avoided, Sam found that the memories didn't hurt quite as much as they usually did. He thought about Jack's words, about respect being something you earn through how you treat others. It was easy to dismiss that kind of thinking when you were focused on survival, when every day was about making it through the next 24 hours without anything terrible happening. But maybe, Sam thought, survival wasn't the same thing as living. Maybe somewhere along the way, he had gotten so focused on just getting through each day that he had stopped thinking about what he wanted those days to add up to. The coffee was still warm when Sam poured himself a second cup from the thermos. Steam rose from the liquid, creating small clouds that disappeared quickly into the cold air. He watched them go, thinking about how temporary everything was, how quickly warmth could disappear if you didn't find ways to keep creating it. A group of teenagers walked past, their voices loud with the kind of energy that comes from being young and feeling invincible. One of them glanced at Sam, then quickly looked away, as if making eye contact with a homeless person might somehow be contagious. Sam didn't take offense. He remembered being that age when other people's problems felt distant and abstract, when it was easy to believe that bad things only happened to people who somehow deserved them. But Jack Morrison hadn't looked away. He had stopped, turned around, and engaged with the situation instead of pretending it didn't exist. More than that, he had treated Sam like someone whose opinions mattered, whose perspective was worth hearing, even when they disagreed about fundamental things. As Sam finished the last of the sandwich, he realized that his anger from earlier in the evening had transformed into something else entirely. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, and it certainly wasn't some sudden belief that all his problems were solved, but it was a recognition that maybe his story wasn't as fixed as he had convinced himself it was, that maybe tomorrow could be different from today if he was willing to make it so. The thermos was still half full, and Sam screwed the cap back on carefully, preserving the remaining warmth for later. He would make it last as long as possible, not just for the physical comfort it provided, but for the reminder it represented that someone had seen him as worthy of care and consideration. Jack Morrison walked slowly down the wet Manhattan street, his boots splashing through shallow puddles that reflected the neon signs and streetlights above. The city's lights created a kaleidoscope of colors on the pavement beneath his feet. Reds from brake lights, yellows from taxicabs, blues and greens from the endless array of business signs that never seemed to sleep. Each step took him further from the corner where he had left Sam Ortiz, but the conversation remained vivid in his mind. The cold air bit at his face as he turned onto the avenue that would take him back to his daughter's apartment. Sarah would probably be asleep by now, her 12-hour shift at the hospital having drained whatever energy she had left for staying awake to hear about her father's evening walk. Jack was grateful for that. He wasn't sure he was ready to explain what had just happened, partly because he wasn't entirely sure he understood it himself. Something about the encounter had stirred up memories that Jack usually kept buried deep. The sandwich and coffee he had given to Sam weren't random acts of charity. They were recreations of a moment from his own past, a moment when someone had shown him kindness during one of the darkest periods of his life. It was during his second deployment overseas, after a particularly brutal week that had cost his unit 3 good soldiers and left Jack questioning everything he thought he knew about duty and purpose. He had been sitting alone outside the mess tent, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to shake the feeling that nothing he did mattered in the grand scheme of things. An older sergeant, a career military man named Rodriguez who rarely spoke to anyone unless it was to bark orders, had appeared beside him with a thermos of real coffee and a sandwich made from supplies he must have saved from his own rations. Rodriguez hadn't said much, just sat there for a while in comfortable silence before telling Jack that some days the only victory was making it through to the next morning, and that was enough. That simple act of recognition, the acknowledgement that Jack was struggling and that his struggle was seen and understood, had meant more than any medal or commendation he had ever received. It had reminded him that he was still human, still worthy of care, even when he felt like he was falling apart from the inside out. Now, walking through Manhattan streets that couldn't be more different from that desert camp, Jack realized he had been looking for opportunities to pass that gift forward ever since. The difference was that Rodriguez had been a fellow soldier, someone who understood the specific challenges Jack was facing. Sam Ortiz was a stranger whose problems came from a completely different set of circumstances. Yet something in Sam's eyes had reminded Jack of his own reflection during that difficult time overseas. The look of someone who was tired of fighting but hadn't figured out how to stop. Jack paused at a red light, watching the late-night traffic flow past in both directions. New York at night was like nothing he had ever experienced. The energy was different from Texas cities, more compressed and intense, as if 8 million people were all trying to live their entire lives in the same small space at the same time. It should have felt overwhelming, but tonight it felt almost comforting, like being part of something larger than himself. As he waited for the light to change, Jack found himself thinking about the assumptions people made about him based on his appearance, his accent, his background. Sam had seen him and immediately decided he represented a certain type of privilege and certainty. In some ways, Sam wasn't wrong. Jack had been blessed with opportunities and support systems that not everyone received. But privilege didn't mean his life had been easy, and certainty was something he had learned to project even when he felt anything but certain inside. The light changed, and Jack crossed the street, his mind still processing the evening's events. He had given Sam food and warmth, but he suspected he had received something in return, though he couldn't quite name what it was. Maybe it was perspective, or maybe it was simply the reminder that connection was possible even between people who seemed to have nothing in common. By the time Jack reached Sarah's building, he had made a decision. Tomorrow, before his flight back to Texas, he would walk past that corner again, not to check on Sam or to expect gratitude for his gesture, but to offer something more substantial than a single meal. He had connections in the construction industry, friends who understood the value of giving someone a second chance. It wouldn't solve all of Sam's problems, but it might provide an opportunity for Sam to solve some of them himself. Jack rode the elevator up to Sarah's floor, listening to the mechanical hum that filled the small space. The building was quiet at this hour. Most of its residents settled in for the night behind doors that looked identical from the hallway, but probably contained lives as different as could be imagined. That was something else he had learned from his time in the military, that everyone carried stories and struggles that weren't visible from the outside, and those stories deserved respect, even when they were hard to understand. As he unlocked Sarah's apartment door and stepped quietly inside, Jack felt something settle in his chest that he recognized as satisfaction. Not the kind that came from accomplishing a specific task or achieving a particular goal, but the deeper satisfaction that came from acting in accordance with his values even when no one was watching, even when the outcome was uncertain. The apartment was warm and quiet, a stark contrast to the cold energy of the city outside. Jack hung up his coat and sat down in the chair by the window, looking out at the lights that never seemed to dim completely. Somewhere out there, Sam Ortiz was probably still sitting on his crate, maybe still drinking the coffee that was gradually cooling in the December air. Tomorrow would bring new challenges for both of them, but tonight felt like enough. What Jack Morrison didn't know as he settled into the warmth of his daughter's Manhattan apartment was that Samuel Ortiz carried secrets that would have surprised even the perceptive Texas veteran. Hidden beneath layers of pride and defensive sarcasm was a history that Sam had spent years trying to forget, a past that made his current situation feel like both an ending and a kind of penance for choices he couldn't undo. 23 years earlier, Sam had been Petty Officer Second Class Samuel Ortiz, a naval aviation mechanic stationed at Naval Air Station Oceana in Virginia Beach. He had been good at his job, the kind of mechanic who could diagnose problems by sound and feel, who took pride in keeping aircraft in perfect working condition because he knew that lives depended on his attention to detail. His toolbox was organized with military precision, his work area spotless, and his reputation solid among both enlisted personnel and officers who relied on his expertise. Sam had joined the Navy straight out of high school in the Bronx, looking for structure and purpose after growing up in a household where both were often in short supply. The military had given him exactly what he was seeking: a sense of belonging, clear expectations, and the satisfaction that came from being genuinely good at something important. For 8 years, he had thrived in the structured environment of naval aviation, earning commendations for his work and respect from his peers. But military service, even in peacetime, carries its own stresses and demands. The long hours, the pressure to maintain perfect standards, and the isolation from civilian life began to wear on Sam in ways he didn't recognize at the time. He started drinking more than regulations allowed, first to unwind after difficult days, then to cope with problems that seemed to multiply faster than he could solve them. What began as a way to manage stress gradually became the source of new and bigger problems. The end came suddenly, the way these things often do. A failed inspection that revealed Sam had been working on aircraft while under the influence. A disciplinary hearing that stripped away 8 years of service in a matter of hours, and a discharge that wasn't quite honorable, but wasn't quite dishonorable either. Sam left the Navy with a severance package, a head full of regret, and no clear idea of what to do with a life that had suddenly lost all its structure and meaning. The transition to civilian life proved harder than Sam had expected. The skills that made him valuable to the Navy didn't translate easily to civilian employment, especially when potential employers saw the circumstances of his discharge. The drinking that had cost him his military career became worse without the discipline and routine that had previously contained it. Jobs came and went, relationships ended before they really began, and slowly but steadily Sam's life contracted until he found himself where he was tonight, sitting on a wooden crate in Manhattan, accepting charity from strangers and trying to remember who he used to be. Sam rarely talked about his military service, partly because the shame of how it ended overshadowed the pride he had once felt in his work, and partly because admitting to his naval background opened doors to questions he didn't want to answer. It was easier to let people assume he had always been a failure, that homelessness was the natural result of poor life choices rather than the complicated endpoint of a series of events that had started with promise and ended in disappointment. But tonight, as Sam sat with Jack Morrison's thermos warming his hands, something about the encounter had stirred up memories he usually kept buried. The way Jack carried himself, the calm authority in his voice, the respect he showed even to someone living on the streets, all of it reminded Sam of the person he used to be, the sailor who took pride in his work and his service to something larger than himself. The coffee was still warm, and Sam took another careful sip, savoring both the heat and the reminder that someone had bothered to make it for him specifically. In the Navy, coffee had been a constant companion, the fuel that powered long shifts and early mornings. The taste brought back memories of dawn patrols and midnight repairs, of the satisfaction that came from solving complex mechanical problems, and the camaraderie that developed between people who depended on each other for their safety and success. For just a moment sitting on that Manhattan street corner, Sam allowed himself to remember what it felt like to be good at something, to be valued for his skills and trusted with important responsibilities. The memories were painful because they highlighted how far he had fallen, but they were also precious because they reminded him that he had once been more than his current circumstances suggested. A late-night delivery truck rumbled past, its engine making the kind of sound that Sam could still diagnose instinctively. The timing was slightly off, probably due to dirty fuel injectors that could be cleaned with the right tools and techniques. Even after all these years, after all the bridges burned and opportunities wasted, the mechanical knowledge remained sharp and ready, waiting for a chance to prove its worth again. Sam finished the last of the coffee and carefully screwed the cap back onto the thermos. Tomorrow would bring the same challenges as every other day: finding food, staying warm, avoiding trouble with police or other street people who might see him as competition or a threat. But tonight felt different somehow, as if Jack Morrison's simple act of recognition had awakened something in Sam that had been sleeping for a very long time. Maybe it was time to stop running from his past and start figuring out how to use the skills and experience he still carried, even if they were buried under years of disappointment and self-doubt. The next morning brought the kind of crisp December sunlight that makes even Manhattan's concrete and steel look almost welcoming. Jack Morrison stood at the window of his daughter's apartment, coffee mug in hand, watching the city wake up below. Sarah had already left for her shift at the hospital, kissing him goodbye and reminding him that his flight back to Texas wasn't until late afternoon. He had the whole day to himself in a city that still felt foreign, despite 3 days of exploration. But Jack's mind wasn't on tourist attractions or last-minute shopping. He kept thinking about the man on the street corner, about the conversation that had started with hostility and ended with something that felt like understanding. More than that, he kept thinking about the look in Sam's eyes when he placed that package on the wooden crate. Not gratitude exactly, but recognition of something deeper than charity. Jack had given away thousands of dollars to various causes over the years, written checks to organizations that helped veterans and homeless individuals, voted for politicians who promised to address social problems. But none of those actions had felt as significant as sharing a sandwich and coffee with one man who had the courage to express his anger instead of hiding it behind polite silence or grateful submission. There was something about direct human connection that couldn't be replicated by institutional charity, no matter how well-intentioned or efficiently organized. When Jack handed Sam that package, he wasn't just providing a meal. He was acknowledging Sam's humanity, his worth as a person whose story mattered regardless of his current circumstances. And in doing so, Jack had reminded himself of something important about his own values and purposes. The interaction had challenged assumptions on both sides. Sam had expected a privileged military man who looked down on people less fortunate than himself. Jack had initially seen an angry homeless man lashing out at convenient targets. Both had discovered that reality was more complicated than their first impression suggested. Sam's anger came from intelligence and pride, not ignorance or simple bitterness. Jack's confidence was built on experience and genuine conviction, not arrogance or blind privilege. But perhaps the most significant aspect of their encounter was what it revealed about the nature of respect and dignity in American society. Sam had accused Jack of thinking he was better than everyone else, but Jack's response suggested a different understanding of superiority, not something claimed or assumed, but something demonstrated through actions and choices over time. It was a distinctly American conversation, touching on themes of individual responsibility, social obligation, and the complex relationship between personal success and community welfare. The regional differences between Texas and New York had provided a backdrop for their discussion, but the real divide wasn't geographical. It was between different ways of understanding what people owe each other and what society owes its most vulnerable members. Jack represented one perspective, that respect is earned through behavior, that dignity comes from how you treat others regardless of your own circumstances. Sam embodied another viewpoint, that systemic failures and individual misfortunes can create situations where earning respect becomes nearly impossible, where dignity is a luxury that homeless people can't afford to maintain. Yet their conversation had found common ground in the recognition that both men had served something larger than themselves, that both understood sacrifice and commitment even if their paths had led to very different destinations. The military connection that would later be revealed added another layer to their interaction, not just two Americans from different regions and social classes, but two men who had worn their country's uniform and understood the weight of service and the difficulty of transition to civilian life. Jack finished his coffee and made a decision. Before heading to the airport, he would walk past that corner one more time, not to check on Sam or to feel good about his own generosity, but to offer something more substantial than a single meal. He had contacts in the construction industry, people who understood that everyone deserved a second chance, and that skills mattered more than circumstances. It wouldn't solve all of Sam's problems, but it might provide an opportunity for Sam to begin solving them himself. The gesture would be a risk for everyone involved. Jack would be vouching for someone he barely knew. Sam would have to confront his own fears about failure and disappointment, and Jack's contacts would have to trust his judgment about a man's character based on a single conversation. But sometimes meaningful change required exactly that kind of risk, the willingness to act on incomplete information because waiting for certainty meant waiting forever. As Jack prepared to leave the apartment, he reflected on the broader implications of what had happened the night before. In a country increasingly divided by politics, economics, and cultural differences, their encounter suggested that genuine communication was still possible between people who seemed to have nothing in common. It required patience, honesty, and the willingness to listen to perspectives that challenged comfortable assumptions. But it could happen. The question was whether such individual connections could scale up to address larger social problems, or whether they remained isolated moments of understanding in an otherwise fragmented society. Jack didn't have answers to those bigger questions, but he had learned something important about the power of treating each person as an individual, with their own story, rather than as a representative of a larger category or problem. Maybe that was enough for now. The recognition that change often began not with grand gestures or policy solutions, but with one person choosing to see another person's humanity, even when it would be easier to look away. The rest, Jack thought as he headed toward the door, would have to take care of itself. So what do you think about Jack's approach that cold Manhattan night? Some people might say he was too confrontational, that he should have just kept walking when Sam made his comment about military folks. Others might argue that Sam was out of line from the start. That respect goes both ways regardless of someone's circumstances. Then there's the question of Jack's final gesture. Was it genuine compassion? Or was it the kind of charity that makes the giver feel better without really addressing the bigger problems? Here's what interests me most about this story. Both men walked away, changed by an encounter that could have easily never happened at all. In your own community, how often do you think conversations like this take place? And when you see someone like Sam on the street, What goes through your mind in that first moment of contact? Drop a comment below and tell me, who do you think handled this situation better? Was Jack right to stop and engage, or should he have minded his own business? And what would have happened if this same conversation took place in your hometown instead of Manhattan? I'm curious to hear your thoughts.